Latin America in Colonial Times. This is our textbook. There's only one little problem with the title of this textbook, and that's why sometimes historians are weird because they believe that the history is just there. It's just there. It's just what happened Latin America in colonial times, in Latin America. So recognize the problem. If you were in colonial times, if you were actually there in colonial times, what's the problem with this title? If you were living in colonial times, you would never have referred to this place where you were as Latin America, because in fact, the term wasn't invented, wasn't even used until the 1850s or 1860s. So there's a little history for you. It was invented after most of these countries had become independent. And the interesting thing about the term Latin America is it actually was mostly popularized by the French. America, I don't speak French. Basically they wanted to take their still holdings in the Americas, and they had some ambitions. In fact, they got into some wars in Mexico. They wanted to take over more of the Americas, but basically they were trying to group themselves with the former Spanish and with the former Portuguese colonies against the United States. And so they got very into this idea of America Latin and popularized it. It became very popular as a term in general, right? And so now it refers basically to a geographical area, but it was in some ways invented as a kind of political term in order to contrast these places with the influence of the U.S. in the continent. So I think that people might have talked about, being in Spanish America. Brazil was actually one of the later places to be independent. It was considered to be a monarchy of the Portuguese. And in fact, many people don't consider Brazil quite part of Latin America because they speak Portuguese. And if you think about Latin America, if you apply it from its original context, then we certainly should include, say, parts of Canada. The French were really as much Latin as the Spanish. So our historians didn't tell us that, but that's where we got the term from. Now, if you think about the term Latin America, if you really want to include all the places that were that became under Spanish, mapped by the Spanish, explored by the Spanish, technically came under Spanish control, all the places that came under Portuguese control, and all the places that came under French control. So if we're talking about Latin America in this sense, then that is pretty much all of South America. It's all of South America, almost all, I guess, with the exception of what is now Suriname, which was once called Dutch Guyana, and what is now called Guyana, which was once British Guyana. But most of South America, almost all of the Caribbean, the Big Islands anyway, and almost all of North America. And in fact, almost all of what is now the United States was once under either Spanish control or under French control. So all of Florida, well, let's just look at a map. This is a map of sort of and this person who did this, that's why I'm citing this person, did a great job with this. The Spanish and Portuguese empires around 1790. As you can see, that blue part is, the blue part is the Spanish part going from here way up through what is now Mexico, all of California, and explored up until Alaska. Eventually ended up getting into fights with the Russians over that part of the world, but at the time it was pretty securely Spanish, along with all of Cuba and Puerto Rico and the larger Caribbean islands. And then you had the Portuguese, who had all of Brazil. We might mention that, in some ways, the Philippines could be considered part of Latin America because it was also colonized by the Spanish for almost the same number of years. So you can see why. So there's, right, French Guyana and Guyana, Suriname. You can see why the Spanish probably weren't that concerned, especially since the French were in here, right? You had a bunch of French settlements all throughout this area. You can see why the Spanish probably weren't that concerned about a few goofy Anglos sitting out there in Massachusetts somewhere. I mean, it was just, they had the world. They had the world under this part of the world was theirs. And again, almost all of what is now the United States. So when we talk about colonial Latin America, this class should be called the Americas. The Americas from 1500 to 1800 or something like that, because we're actually talking about our own history. So when I said, do you have any experience in Latin America? If you've ever lived or been west of, say, the Mississippi, you do, because that was all Latin America. Or down to Florida. Anybody ever been to Florida? Okay, thank goodness. There you go. There's your Latin American experience. You have it just as much. But I say this because I want to give you a sense of the scope of what we're talking about. We're actually talking about the history of the Americas, of our continent during this time. And a lot of what was happening, when we learn about colonial America, we learn about a tiny, tiny slice, at least in school. We learn about a tiny slice of what was happening in the Northeast. Eventually, of course, it became much bigger, but at the time, the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese were the big players here. This is also the time in which the whole idea that there is a Western civilization, is in part spurred or comes about because of the colonial experience in the Americas. I really didn't know how to say this, kind of like the title of this book, which is a book called 1492, The Year the World Began. I was going to say this class is about when the world became the world, in the sense that before this time, people moved around and they migrated and they traveled. But the idea that the world was one interconnected whole as a globe was obviously it didn't work before these transoceanic voyages really took off. And the idea that there was a Western hemisphere, or the idea of Western civilization, is really crucial to how this whole process unfolded and what these countries would do in the Americas. And this was at a time, as we'll read, when these places were themselves becoming countries. So, as I've noted, in chapter 2 is called Castile and Portugal. Castile, the kingdom of Castile, is what we're going to be talking about, because there wasn't such a thing as a Spain. The kingdom of Castile and the kingdom of Aragon. And the whole idea that there was a Spain comes about later on. So in this empire building process, when these two kind of minor places, Portugal and Spain, which are kind of didn't seem that big or important, when they start building these global empires, they also claim to be then descendants of of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And so what I'm trying to say here, which many historians have said in other ways, is that we have sometimes this idea that Western civilization was born with Plato and sort of continues up through Europe until we get to us. And here we are, the college, learning about Western civilization. What really happened is that you had the ancient Greeks who probably considered themselves to be more Asiatic or more oriented toward the East than they were toward the West. And then their knowledge basically goes away during the Middle Ages in Europe. They're not doing much of anything there. Wow, that's an exaggeration, but they're not preserving that ancient knowledge. The people who preserved the ancient knowledge of the Greeks were actually the Muslims who had preserved those ancient texts and were working on them and then reintroduced them into Spain and Portugal because they were under Islamic control. So it was during the time, you know, from say 1500s, 1600s in there, that people in Europe started to rediscover some of these texts and then tried to make themselves out to be the heirs or the inheritors of this, and talked about themselves as being part of Western civilization. So this is about that period when both the Americas were built, but fueled this expansion of the idea of the West. This class is then also about, during this time, how we became a globally interconnected capitalist economy. And there are two huge things that happen in Latin America, which were extremely important to that. One of those is the massive extraction of silver, especially from a little place in what is now Bolivia and Potosi, which produced something like half or 2/3 of the world's silver supply. And this was enormously important as Europe was trying to get into those Asian trade routes and those kinds of things. This kind of activation of the monetary economy was crucially important for the development of the global economy. The other crucial thing that happens in much of the Americas, especially in what we might consider the Greater Caribbean. So we've been talking about the Guyanas, which is why the British and the French and the Dutch were there trying to set up plantations, mostly for growing sugar, which would then be, much of it was processed and then shipped back into Europe, which would fuel the industrial working class later on. Or as Sidney Mintz, anthropologist, talks about, oh, by the way, that Potosi book is by Chris Lane, who's one of the authors of our textbook. How sugar becomes one of the main sources of calories for many people around the world has to do with African enslavement and what people were able to do with sugar plantations. And of course, even our word for sugar, azúcar, is the Spanish word for sugar, but as you might be able to hear, azúcar is actually derived from an Arabic word, and it was introduced by the Muslims in that part of the world. So what I'm trying to tell you here is that in some ways, the themes of this class are enormous, or they're big themes. They're about the Americas, our whole continent, during this time. They're about the birth of these ideas about the West, and they're about the birth of how we got to be a capitalist society. We often learn about the Industrial Revolution, but it's hard to imagine the Industrial Revolution without these the silver and the sugar, which was fueling the trade and quite literally powering the workers who would be in those factories. Mintz has claimed that the plantations also provided a template for factory production, that the work hours and the regimentation of labor on the plantations were, in fact, huge in what would become factory production later on. This time period also gives us the roots of these ideas that we are still carrying around with us, and we're still trying to work out the legacy of. Things like the idea of race. Before the colonial period, people talked about physical differences and biological differences, but the idea that people were grouped into these categories as Black, as white, as indigenous or Indian, those come about from the experiences of the Americas, grouping together and separating people on a transoceanic scale. People didn't really think about themselves or others as belonging to racial groups before this time. Also, how people should relate to the environment. The idea that many Europeans had that the Americas were somehow some kind of Garden of Eden, some sort of blank slate that they could go in and just take whatever they wanted, comes to us from this time. And so sort of these big ideas as, well, who is a human being? Do the indigenous people of the Americas, are they part of the human condition? Do they deserve to be treated as human beings? Who is a human being? What are humans like? What is human nature? And how are we obligated to treat each other? The biggest debates in Spanish colonialism is over the rights of the indigenous people. Should they have rights? How should humans, what should we be doing to each other? Who counts as a human? And what is the relationship, of course, between humans and the natural world? And the indigenous peoples of the Americas had some very different ideas about property ownership, about what you should do with the land. And, the Europeans developed ideas about extraction and production and appropriation of this time, which we're still living out the consequences of today as we know. So I guess what I'm trying to tell us is that it is great to be studying history because there it is, it's just there. And if we do nothing else but learn a bunch of facts about Latin American colonial times, I'll be happy. But every so often we want to put it into that big, that's where the anthropology comes in, that big picture stuff about, hey, what is a human? How should we be to each other? How should we be to the environment? Or as Charles Mann put it in his follow-up to 1491, which is called 1493. Everybody gets very excited about these years. How Europe's discovery of the Americas, and, he should probably revise that a tiny bit, but revolutionized trade, ecology, and life on Earth. That's pretty big, right? Revolutionized trade, ecology, and life on Earth. So this is the most important class you can take in college.